Hello ladies and gentlemen, Jacob Licklider here with a different sort of video. On Twitter, I follow a guy called the GD256. He's also a YouTuber, and he's doing a series where he reviews the Virgin New Adventures. But he's also just in general a booktuber, and he created a book tag based off of the first 12 Virgin New Adventures books, obviously, and he tagged me to do it, so I am going to do it because outside of this channel, I do actually have a big love of reading and have always wanted to try to get some book type content on this channel. I've been able to do it on my blog. If you're not following my blog, where I've been doing Doctor Who books and then just started branching out to general fantasy that I've read, check that out. But yeah, there are 12 questions. The 12 questions will be in the description if you'd like to do this tag, along with his channel and his video doing it, because he kind of wants this to blow up. So if you're interested in doing this, go ahead and make your own video, because I don't know if I'll actually tag anyone. But without further ado, let's get started on part 1 of the VNA book tag celebrating the first 12 Virgin New Adventures. So for Timewyrm Genesis, the first book, the tag question is, name a book that doesn't do adult content correctly. And, you know, I should have mentioned this at the top, but this will be one adult content, as is on my channel. It's not entirely meant for kids. But name a book that doesn't do adult content correctly. I'd have to choose It by Stephen King. Now, I'm going to be honest, it's not for the violence or the horror, or even the adult themes, because I actually think the adult themes and the themes of growing up in It is something that Stephen King does amazingly, and I do adore the book It. It was a great read. I read it this past October, and it was really genuinely enjoyable. But I'm going to be talking about the rather, of course, the infamous scene near the end that just doesn't work. You know, it's really one of those weird things. The famous gangbang in the sewers with the kids in It, which is been cut out of every adaptation for good reason, because it just doesn't make much sense. For Timewyrm Exodus, the prompt is name a story that seems to completely shift plots halfway through. A lot of things I could choose. I'm going to go with American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Mainly because of a big twist near the end that sort of recontextualizes stuff. Also, just at the halfway point, there's this major shift in tone that Gaiman pulls off excellently. The first half of the book is kind of a road trippy type novel type thing, while the second half is a bit more intense character study, staying in one place. It's a very weird transition that shouldn't necessarily work, but Gaiman, I think, does an excellent job of making it work, and making a great, a great story about it. So for Timewyrm Apocalypse, the prompt is name the most forgettable book you've ever read. I'm going to go with a book called Touching Spirit Bear by Ben Michelson. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it. This was a book I had to read when I was much, much younger in school, and I vaguely remember it. It was one of the few books I had to when you had to be forced to read in school that I genuinely disliked, and I genuinely forgot most of it by the time, we were tested on it, because it was around, a kid who, committed a crime and was like, oh, to get out of the crime, I'm going to do Native American justice by, I think it was something like he had to survive in a circle, in a Native American village or something like that, and there's this bear that was this metaphor for his inner demons. It kind of felt like it was trying to be a very deep book, but wasn't actually that deep. The deep stuff was very surface level and very obvious, even for a book aimed at younger children. It also felt like it was trying to be like almost edgy for younger children to make them feel like adults, and kind of failed at that. And honestly, I don't remember much of it. I remembered except just kind of disliking it. Timewyrm Revelation. What book series has the best finale? And with that, I'm going with the first Mistborn Trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. So, The Final Empire / Mistborn, depending on whatever you want to call it. The Well of Ascension and The Hero of Ages. It's a fantasy trilogy by Sanderson, and I think it's a trilogy that each book builds on each other and very much comes to a nice conclusion. Now, I do know that there are more Mistborn books after it, but those are set further in the future, and don't deal with the same characters. So very much this trilogy and I haven't read them. I genuinely have not read those books yet, but the first Mistborn Trilogy, specifically The Hero of Ages, is a great book. A controversial opinion, I think The Hero of Ages is the best book in the trilogy, where it seems to be, Well of Ascension seems to be, like, the most popular one. But I think Hero of Ages has the best villain defeat. It has everything go up, and it does some really nice twists that are set up incredibly well throughout the basically throughout, it's hinted at throughout the trilogy, and just does some really, really solid stuff. And if you haven't read it, and you haven't read anything Sanderson, this is also just a good place to start with Brandon Sanderson as an author. So yeah, go ahead and read it. Cradle times Crucible. Which book do you love that you would never recommend to other people? I'm going to go with A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle. It's the first Sherlock Holmes story, and I love it. I love all of Conan Doyle's Holmes work, but it's very much a book of its time in that it's structured like halfway through you have the crime solved, and the second half of the book is basically how the criminal got away with it. It's a very weird thing for a modern audience to read and get into. It's a weird thing. It's kind of why that it's never actually really been adapted into. It's one of the lesser adapted Holmes stories, I think, because of it. Really, the only big adaptation I can think of it that tried to do it was A Study in Pink for Moffat and Gatiss' Sherlock. But yeah, it's still a great book. But yeah, it's just that weird structure prevents me from recommending it. For Cat's Cradle Warhead, what book holds a bigger story in its pages and handles it really well? I'm going with Brandon Sanderson's Words of Radiance, the second book in his Stormlight Archive series, which isn't finished yet, but it may be my favorite series from him. Each of the Stormlight books are incredibly long, yet Words of Radiance in particular has a lot of really nice subtleties and hints at larger things in the world and things going on in the background, especially that I think really show that there's going to be more to the series. And I think it's important to be put here because Book 4 is coming out next November. So if you haven't read the Stormlight Archive, they're massive undertakings and they will take you a while, but all three books are well worth it, especially if you're a fan of epic fantasy, and a fan of fantasy that isn't necessarily as medieval inspired as you might think. It's one that I think it has a really unique world and different world building, which is another thing that Sanderson does. Like, there's just a lot here in this second book. Like, the first book had plenty of world building, and so does Oathbringer, but I think Words of Radiance is really where a lot of the hints start being laid and a lot of it gets started. And basically just built up from there, and a bunch of, and it's a bunch of things done there. All right, Cat's Cradle Witchmark, name a novel which does its genre a disservice, and I am going to go with The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett, which isn't a bad book by any means, but it is the first Discworld book, the first sort of absurdist fantasy. It's a very absurdist fantasy, and it's very much trying to be a satire. But actually, sadly, the satire doesn't go deep, and Pratchett clearly hasn't sort of worked out his world yet, and it really just doesn't do a Terry Pratchett novel justice, and it doesn't necessarily do fantasy justice. It comes across more as derivative than actually being referencing things to actually satirize them. It doesn't, which is it's just sort of it's just a very disjointed novel, probably his weakest Discworld book overall. Which, you know, considering it's the first, it's not necessarily the worst thing to have be your worst is to be the first. But yeah. All right, Nightshade. Name your favorite standalone work. I'm going to go with Dracula by Bram Stoker. Dracula is this amazing gothic tale of horror. It's never been adapted properly into anything because it's very much an unadaptable book, all about friendship and facing one's demons and coming in to understand oneself. It's a book that I come back to a lot. I really do enjoy it. It's written in this very interesting style. It's such a slow burn. I've written an essay. I wrote like a big final rhetoric capstone paper on Dracula and just sort of what it means. It's an amazing story all about, you know, just sort of it's weirdly doing the power of friendship in perhaps in a very subtle, less corny way than it seems to have been. And it's also just a good examination of Victorian society and science and a bunch of different things, and I adore it for it. It's very much a book that if you haven't read it, it's in public domain. You can get an ebook copy for free. Just look around, or any of if you want a print copy, they're pretty easy to find, cheap, because it's, you know, it's a public domain story, and it's been adapted. So if you think you know the story of Dracula, you probably really don't, and definitely try to track it down and read it. All right, Love and War. Name a novel with an emotional ending, but don't spoil it. I'm going to go with The Gathering Storm by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, which is the 12th book in the Wheel of Time series. I'm glad, which is actually one of my favorite fantasy series, though I haven't finished it. The ending of The Gathering Storm is incredibly important. Like, the entire ending sequence essentially takes a character, puts him to the lowest of the lows, and then tries to make him start building up from there. It's very much the emotional climax of the series overall. And it's the first book where, with that character, you feel like you've had any significant, real progress with him understanding, which makes it really, really satisfying and really, really emotional for just what happens. And it's shocking, and it's a lot of amazing things happen. So, you know, definitely read Wheel of Time. It's great, and I won't go into too much more with that there. All right, for Transit, it's name a controversial book and give your opinion on it. This is the one Doctor Who book on the list, and it's a VNA, Long Barrow by Mark Platt. Long Barrow is incredibly controversial for revealing the looms, the House of Long Barrow, the whole idea of the Doctor being the other, and generally just sort of cementing this idea of this sort of non-traditional family on Gallifrey. And it is a very controversial thing. Mainly the ideas about it are very controversial in Doctor Who fandom, but I disagree with the controversy. I think it is an incredibly well-written novel, perhaps one of the best Doctor Who books ever written, and a perfect ending to the VNAs. It at least in the McCoy portion of the VNAs, there's one more after it with the Eighth Doctor that works as a very nice epilogue. But it's one of those things. It's one of those books where you have to realize what it's trying to do, and very much go around with it. It's doing a very different thing to a lot of Doctor Who stories. It's very reflective and very much looking back as well as looking forward to the future, and just sort of celebrating the Seventh Doctor, the Virgin books in general, and it was very much as like it's very much a proper ending, and it really the looms shouldn't be controversial. It's before I go, looms are canon, but yeah, I'll read Long Barrow. Try to find the PDF if you can, because yeah, it's an expensive thing to find, but I do adore it so much. The Highest Science. What is the most fun you've had reading a novel? Terry Pratchett's Witches Abroad. It's like all the Discworld books, there is very much a spoof and a theme here. This one is doing fairy tales and the nature of good and evil, and right versus good. But it's as with many of his witches books, just the trio of Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Ogg, and Magritte Garlic are hilarious. Part of it's, again, very much parodying like fairy tales and having a lot of fun with just like road travel, and it's playing around with tropes, and it's a book that will make you laugh out loud at points. Just for what it does, and just for what a lot of it means. So, like, if you have it's a really solid Discworld book. It's one of those books that, you know, you really sort of cement. If you haven't read Terry Pratchett, I don't know if it's necessarily a good place to start, but it's because it is technically like the second Witches book, I think. I'm pretty sure it's just the second, unless I'm forgetting, because the other one is Weird Sisters. But it is perhaps the most fun I've had with a Witches book, and one of the funniest of the Witches books. And I very much enjoy it. So yeah, Witches Abroad. And finally, for The Pit, name a book which nearly or did turn you off a series. This one did turn me off a series. Wizard's First Rule by Terry Goodkind, which is 800 pages of utter crap. It is an incredibly derivative fantasy novel, literally taking stuff from The Lord of the Rings and The Wheel of Time, and just it doesn't have a good sense of tone. The tone is inconsistent. There's a point where it's like, oh, this is doing very happy Lord of the Rings type things, like I could possibly with my children, and then suddenly several pages of torture on the level, just like extreme torture. Like it's very tonally inconsistent because of that. It makes very little sense, and like it's very much the protagonist is very much a Mary Sue who's just sort of he doesn't struggle, and Goodkind seems to think that he's some big nuanced character, and he's really not, and it's just not a great thing. The series and I've heard that this one is like the best book in the entire series, which is not good because it wasn't great. Like this was 800 pages, and it took me like 2 weeks to get through because I did not enjoy it. It's like, oh, I gotta read this again. Here we go. And you know, it's highly derivative. It's not a decent. It's not a good book in any sense of the word. And for some reason, the series is popular, and I don't know why. Like there are points where it's literally just the main character monologuing. Here is my political message. It's not how you integrate politics into a story. That's just no. You don't just be like, here's my message, camera. It's not a good book. So that was the VNA tag. Thanks, Mason, for tagging me. If I was going to tag anyone, I would have to be tagging maybe Brian Corrigan, aka Briarheart02. But I don't think just because I want to see how he would react to this. If you're interested in doing the tag, I will have the tag information in the description. Thank you for watching. Leave a like, comment what you thought of this, if you'd like to see maybe more book type content on the channel, or if you have any book recommendations. This gives you a decent smattering of sort of things that I like. So if you have anything that you think I might like, as always, leave it in the comments, and let's get a conversation going. And join me next time when your regular scheduled marathon content returns, the next video should be out in a couple of days, I think. I'm still on track. So yeah, thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, and goodbye.